Welcome everybody to another Authors at Google Talk. Today we have with us author Richard Martin, whose new book just came out. Let me actually bring it. This is the book, Superfuel, Thorium, the green energy source for the future. We had several speakers at Google already talk about thorium, but Richard is the author who actually brought the whole thorium discussion to the forefront here with his piece in the Wired magazine. He's been a science writer for many years. He's also an award-winning journalist, and he is the editorial director of Pike Research, a leading clean energy firm. He lives in Boulder, Colorado with his wife and son. I just want to introduce to those of you who haven't heard about thorium much, I think it's, as you probably know, over 60% of our energy today comes from coal, gas, and petroleum. And this is causing a lot of issues. You've all heard, like Al Gore's talks. I would like to plug in for those of you who really think that, there's still a debate going on CO2 or something, to go and look back at Inez Funk's talk on climate modeling, which is also available on YouTube, and which should convince you that, it's really serious stuff. Thorium as the energy source is an important gap step if you're trying to deal with this issue seriously. So please welcome Richard Martin to share with us.
Thank you, Boris, and thank you to everyone for coming. It's been interesting. The Wired story on thorium came out at the end of 2009, so I've been reporting on this for about 3 years, and it's really been interesting to see this movement that really started out with a committed band of outsiders really grow to a worldwide wave in which there are actual businesses raising actual money and hopefully building and licensing actual reactors. I am going to sort of give you the final chapter of the book today and really start from the 60,000 foot view and sort of zoom in and talk about what needs to happen to actually make thorium power a reality. So we're going to actually start with the Roman Empire. In 416 AD, a Roman bureaucrat named Rutilius Nemesianus set out from the imperial capital to his homeland of Gaul, and he wrote a long poem, a verse account of his journey, which was called De Reditu Suo, which means of his return. And it gives a very vivid portrait of the empire in decline. It was several decades before the traditional fall of the Roman Empire. And the most remarkable thing about Rutilius's return was that he traveled by boat. And the reason that's remarkable, of course, is that the Roman Empire was famed for its vast network of roads that really connected most of the known world. And here's what he said: "I have chosen the sea, since roads by land, if on the level, are flooded by rivers, if on higher ground are beset with rocks. Since Tuscany and since the Aurelian highway, after suffering the outrages of Goths with fire or sword, can no longer control forest with homestead or river with bridge, it is better to entrust my sails to the wayward sea." In other words, by the time of Rutilius's return, the empire's decline was already inescapable. Roads had decayed, aqueducts had collapsed, cities lay in ruin, harbors had silted. So why did the Roman Empire fall? Someone has counted up the number of theories to explain the fall of Rome, and they counted 210 theories. From poisoning with wine goblets made of lead, to moral decay, to the hiring of mercenaries to replace the traditional Roman legionaries. The one that really interests me here was outlined by Joseph Tainter in a 1990 book called The Collapse of Complex Societies. And it has to do with what's called energy return on investment. So put simply, the energy required to maintain the Roman lifestyle, all those monuments, games and spectacles, feasts, and centrally heated bathhouses, became more and more costly as the centuries passed. Fertile cropland was depleted, and landscapes were deforested. the empire had to import grain from farther and farther afield, even as the imperial infrastructure, roads, bridges, aqueducts, grain mills, fortifications, and so on, fell into disrepair. Remote borders became harder to defend. And the army, the source of Rome's might for a millennium, went underfed and unmotivated. By the end, Rome was easy pickings for the barbarian hordes. So here's Tainter actually in an interview. The great problem Rome faced was when they would have to incur very high costs just to maintain the status quo. They had to invest very high amounts in solving problems that didn't yield a positive return, but instead simply allowed them to maintain what they already had. And I would argue that that's a very succinct description of the predicament we find ourselves in today. So essentially, Imperial Rome fell because it failed to diversify its energy sources. And notably, an innovative technology existed to do just that. Rome was the first civilization to develop all the necessary components for the world's first steam engine, but it never built one for practical use. In the 1st century AD, a man named Hero of Alexandria, who was a Greek living under Roman rule, described an Aelophile, which was named for Aeolus, the god of wind, which is now considered the first device powered by steam. It was a water-filled cauldron, that's the big container you see, heated by a fire, obviously, with a pair of tubes projecting upwards from its lid. The tube supported a metal sphere that spun on its horizontal axis, with 2 nozzles or tip jets protruding from it and bent in opposite directions. Expelled through nozzles, steam generated thrust that spun the ball. It was considered a marvel of ingenuity, but something of a parlor trick. The Romans never thought to use steam to drive machines to perform labor. Why should they, when slave labor was so cheap and plentiful? So moving forward in time a bit, in her great book, The March of Folly, the historian Barbara Tuchman catalogs a series of critical turning points at which governments and societies trapped in the status quo despite mounting contrary evidence failed to leap imaginatively, to take bold and visionary steps into the future and to change the course of events. Tuchman called it pursuit of policy contrary to self-interest. And some of the points that she described were the start of World War I, Vietnam and the U.S., etc. The U.S. and Vietnam, etc. And here's what Tuchman wrote. Wooden-Headedness consists of assessing a situation in terms of preconceived fixed notions while ignoring or rejecting any contrary signs. That definition applies perfectly to our current nuclear power industry, and I would argue the whole power system. Ignoring the potential for thorium power in the 1960s and 1970s, which is what we did, was short-sighted. To do so now would be folly. And going back to Rome for a moment, in the 3rd century AD, the Emperor Diocletian staved off the fall of the empire for a few decades by oppressing the peasantry, raising taxes to crushing levels, expanding a stifling bureaucracy, and building up the army through the employment of mercenaries. Diocletian assessed the situation in terms of his preconceptions. And it worked for a while, but it looks mighty foolish 17 centuries later. So let's talk about nuclear power for a moment. And most of you will be familiar with what I'm about to talk about. Nuclear power provides about 20% of the electricity in the US and about the same percentage worldwide. In France, it's much higher. It's about 80% in France. And by many measures, the nuclear power industry has been successful. Despite some very spectacular accidents, which I'll talk about in a moment, it has a relatively clean safety record. And over the last 10 years, what's happened is the nuclear power industry has gone through what they call uprating, which basically means running the reactors at higher power levels than they were conventionally designed for. And they've relicensed existing power plants beyond their original design life, which to me doesn't sound like a recipe for sustained prosperity. The other thing about nuclear power is that it's stagnant in terms of innovation. So the Nuclear Regulatory Commission just licensed the first new nuclear plant in the U.S. in 34 years. And it's a 2-reactor plant in Georgia. And it's conventional light water uranium reactors, which is basically 40-year-old technology. And if you think about what happens here and at your company, what's happened over those 4 decades, it's as if we're all still using Atari 800 computers from about 1980. And so the nuclear power industry has suffered from a lack of innovation. And the other thing that's happened is the people who are running the nuclear power industry today are the same people who brought you 3 Mile Island. Because what happened was when the industry began to really stagnate in the 80s, people didn't go into it. They started going elsewhere. They went to Wall Street. They started going to Silicon Valley, et cetera. So there's kind of a donut hole in the middle in terms of personnel in the industry. That's starting to change. A lot of young people are starting to go into the industry again, and nuclear engineering departments are starting to get full again. But something needs to change to really bring the industry into the 21st century. And I would argue that it's thorium. So just briefly on thorium, I'm going to assume that a lot of you have heard of thorium power. As Boris mentioned, Kirk Sorensen has been here. He's one of the kind of leaders of the Thorium Revival in the US. Thorium is about 4 times as abundant as uranium. It's about as common as lead. I've heard it said that in India, which by some measures has the largest resources of thorium in the world, if you scoop up a handful of sand on a beach in Mumbai, you've got enough thorium in your hand to power the city for a year. That sounds apocryphal to me, but it does give you a sense of how common it is and what a dense and efficient source of energy it is. The other thing about thorium is that it's fertile, it's not fissile. And what I mean by that is you can't cram a bunch of thorium into a small space and create a critical mass and start a spontaneous chain reaction. You have to have an external source of neutrons. And what happens when you bombard thorium with neutrons, it goes through a nuclear decay chain and eventually reaches actually an isotope of uranium, which is U-233. The type of uranium that is consumed in nuclear reactors is actually U-235, which is very rare in nature. So that's why you have to enrich natural uranium up to a certain level of U-235 to create a substance you can use to run a reactor with. If you enrich uranium to about 3 to 5% or maybe 7% U-235, you've got reactor-grade uranium. If you continue and enrich it to 20%, you've got weapons-grade uranium. And so that's the drama, the dilemma we see unfolding in Iran right now. If you have a civilian nuclear power industry with centrifuges to enrich uranium, it's relatively easy to enrich it to weapons-grade. You don't have to enrich thorium at all. You can use naturally occurring thorium. You do need a small igniter fuel to bombard the thorium, and it transmutes on its own and becomes U-233, which is in many ways a better source of energy than U-235. Finally, the nuclear waste issue, which, as you know, we have totally failed to solve. The Obama administration is in favor of new nuclear power, but it has essentially killed the Yucca Mountain storage facility. Those are irreconcilable positions, and we don't have a solution for nuclear waste right now. So if you use thorium in the right kind of reactors, which I'm going to describe in a minute, they're called liquid fluoride thorium reactors. Not only do they produce much, much less waste, which is much shorter lived in terms of the radiotoxicity, you can also consume or process existing waste from conventional nuclear reactors and burn it down essentially into a form that's much easier to store and much easier to deal with. And I've had people argue against that, but the fact is the way to solve the nuclear waste problem is to build liquid fluoride thorium reactors, which are known as lifters. And there are several other advantages to using thorium instead of uranium, one of which is thorium is a distributed resource. There will never be a Saudi Arabia of thorium. It's found everywhere. Everybody has a little, a lot of people have a lot. The US has the latest estimate, although these estimates are often revised, is that the US has 440,000 tons of uranium resources in the ground. The other thing is we've got a bunch that has already been produced for the experiments that went on in the 60s. It's sitting in the desert in Nevada. It's enough to power the U.S. for the next 100 years. And the current plan on the part of the DOE is to downblend that thorium with spent uranium fuel and bury it, essentially. So that gives you a sense of how crazy our policy is right now on nuclear power. Enacting the same policy that hasn't worked to date, only more forcefully, is an accurate description of the nuclear industry's strategy for its so-called nuclear renaissance. Energy policy is a toxic blend of wooden-headedness, economic self-interest, scientific ignorance, theology, and technological inertia. In particular, the nuclear power industry suffers from technological lock-in, which I'm sure is a term that all of you are familiar with. The tendency of established technologies to crowd other competing and possibly superior systems out of the market. The best known example, of course, is our friend Microsoft. Few people would suggest that Windows is the ideal operating system for a personal computer, but Bill Gates is a brilliant and ruthless businessman, and even today, Windows controls something like 90% of the PC market. And the stagnation of nuclear power technology has followed similar lines, and it was apparent a long time ago. Back in 1990, Robin Cowan, who's a professor at the University of Strasbourg, wrote, "While an appropriate decision at the time, it now seems that light water reactors, in other words, conventional uranium-based reactors, may have been an unfortunate choice." One of the interesting features of this history is the belief held by many that light water is not the best technology, either economically or technically. And I've talked to a lot of people in the nuclear establishment, as I call it, over the last few years, and just about every one of them at some point has uttered a version of what I think is a classic quote, and this came from a guy named Paul Genoa, who's a spokesman for the Nuclear Energy Institute, which is the DC-based trade association. It's the lobbying group for the nuclear power industry. And he was interviewed by the Nashville Tennessean newspaper in a story about thorium. And here's what he said. He said, "You don't just walk away from the established technology base, the reactor fleet that we have today, and try the new shiny toy, even if the new shiny toy might work better." So think about that for a minute, even if it works better. So let's talk about risk. In September of 2010, a natural gas pipeline exploded in San Bruno, California, not far from here. It killed 8 people immediately, 35 houses were leveled, dozens more were damaged. It created a crater 167 feet long, 26 feet wide, and 39 feet deep. It was like an asteroid the size of a refrigerator had gouged the earth. When's the last time you saw a headline about the San Bruno natural gas explosion? And natural gas is considered a relatively clean fuel, right? And we have a bunch of it, and it's really cheap right now. But that accident was one of a rash of industrial accidents around fossil fuels that included the 2006 Sago mine disaster, which killed 12 people, the collapse of the Kingston fossil plant in Tennessee in 2008, which resulted in the largest release of coal ash in U.S. history, and the Upper Big Branch coal mine explosion, which killed 29 miners in April of 2010. The most famous, though, was the April 2010 blast that brought down the Deepwater Horizon offshore oil rig, killing 11 workers and spilling 206 million gallons of crude oil into the Gulf of Mexico. Other countries have not been immune. In July 2010, an oil pipeline exploded at the port of Dalian in northeast China, resulting in the worst oil spill in Chinese history. Now let's talk about Fukushima Daiichi, and I'm going to preface this by saying I am not dismissing the seriousness of that accident. But if you step back for a minute and think about the nuclear accident at the Fukushima Daiichi plant, 3 people died. 2 were workers trapped in the turbine hall of reactor 4, which ironically was the only reactor that contained no fuel at the time of the earthquake and tsunami. A 3rd man died at Fukushima Daini, which is Daiichi's sister plant nearby. Again, it will take many decades and billions of dollars to clean up after the Fukushima nuclear accident. And as you've seen in the headlines recently, they're now seeing radioactive tuna show up off the coast of California, which is worrisome. And the damage to the national psyche of Japan, which is a country, of course, it's the only country that's had two cities destroyed by nuclear bombs, and which really has worked since World War II to harness the power of nuclear energy for good. The damage to the national psyche there has been incalculable. And of course, Japan's last reactors have either shut down or in the process of shutting down. But in the context of the wider earthquake and tsunami, which killed at least 18,000 people, the nuclear accident was a footnote. And in comparison with the series of fossil fuel disasters that I've just described, it hardly rates mention. Arnold Gunderson is a former nuclear power executive who served as an expert witness in the investigation of the 3 Mile Island accident. And he's become sort of a loud voice in opposition to nuclear power. And he called Fukushima the biggest industrial catastrophe in the history of mankind. So my point is, that gives you an idea of how distorted our views of nuclear power and radioactivity and nuclear accidents really are. Fukushima also highlighted our inability to accurately calculate risk. From its earliest days, the nuclear power industry has faced a fundamental dichotomy around risk. The chances of a significant accident at any single nuclear power plant are very, very low. But the theoretically possible consequences of a runaway accident are almost unimaginable. And my view is that risk aversion in the nuclear power industry takes two forms. One is technological, one is financial. Apart from a relatively small group of scientists and engineers who I profile in Superfuel, most nuclear technologists today are hemmed in by an incrementalism that eliminates the possibility of bold and visionary leaps. The Blue Ribbon Commission on America's Nuclear Future, which was formed by the Obama administration soon after Barack Obama took office, has looked at various pathways forward for nuclear power in the 21st century, including on that list is thorium reactors. But the chances of getting something licensed in this country and getting financed and getting built are slim. Only the smallest and most predictable next step is safe enough to pursue. The perception of danger is too high. As a result, we're stuck with 1970s technology. It's like we're driving Ford Fairlanes that have been souped up to run at higher RPMs and have a new pair of white walls on them. That's our current reactor fleet. So here's the real risk, and Boris referred to this. This is one of many charts. This basically is various predictions of the rise in temperature through the end of the century in degrees Celsius. And this is what scares me. So if you look at the risk of a nuclear power accident in general from conventional nuclear power, much less from thorium reactors, which are far safer, versus this risk that we're looking at, there's no comparison. We're hastening the onset of disastrous global climate change by continuing to burn fossil fuels. And just a word about natural gas. I just wrote part of a cover package for Fortune magazine about the natural gas boom. And that's a great thing for America. $2 natural gas is a great thing. And we're actually exporting natural gas from the Gulf Coast to Western Europe, because even with the transport costs, which with natural gas are pretty high, the price once you get it to Brussels or wherever in Europe, it's still much cheaper. That's not going to last. That price imbalance is not going to last. The natural gas industry is not yet, the market is not yet globalized like the oil industry is, and that's going to change. So being simply the low-cost provider of cheap energy is not a pathway to sustained prosperity. So if we continue on our current path, large coastal cities could be underwater, millions of acres of agricultural land will have turned to desert, severe drought will be widespread, resource wars fought over increasingly scarce supplies of water and energy will be common, and so on. But again, we have a perceptual problem. The prospect of global climate change is sort of abstract and distant to most Americans. And there have been some polls recently that are sort of staggering, that only something like 35% of Americans consider global climate change a real threat. They're a lot less terrifying than the tiny but real risk of nuclear accident, which has been, of course, amply displayed at Chernobyl and now at Fukushima. So we're not good at calculating risk. And our inability to calculate risk is multiplied by what Nassim Nicholas Taleb in his bestseller, The Black Swan, called the false belief that our tools can measure uncertainty. And Taleb goes on, the application of the sciences of uncertainty to real-world problems has had ridiculous effects. And of course, he was referring mostly to the financial markets, where the tendency to overlook outlying and unlikely possibilities, which he terms black swan events, helped lead to the economic crash of 2008. Taleb argues that it's human nature when you're planning for the future not to account for highly improbable yet catastrophic disruptions. The explosion of the Space Shuttle Columbia, for instance, the assassination of JFK, or the Fukushima tsunami, because our forecasting models are ruled by the bell curve of predictability. Nuclear power has the opposite problem. Nuclear power is one of the few areas of modern life where the merest possibility of a black swan event, another Chernobyl or another Fukushima, has trapped the entire industry in a net of anxiety and caution. Nuclear power, as I said, has a reverse black swan problem. And to me, it's similar to the so-called war on terror. Since 2001, fears of another terror attack have poisoned American life and cost America billions of dollars in ways both visible, in terms of long lines of security at airports, for instance, and invisible, including the difficulty of foreigners to come work for companies like Google because of visa issues. Despite the comparatively clean safety record of the nuclear power industry, the potential of nuclear power, at least in the U.S., has been stifled by risks that are almost too small to measure. So there's obvious counterexamples in U.S. history. Two of the most obvious are the Manhattan Project and the Apollo program to land men on the moon. The similarities in those both depended on technologies that did not exist when the programs began. Both called forth entire new industries based around those technologies, industries that had no obvious everyday benefits or profit potential before they arose, and both involved high opportunity cost in that they demanded resources, financial and intellectual, that could have been devoted to other more easily obtainable objectives. And of course, I'm sure you're all, the thought bubble right now is the internet above your heads, you know, a very similar situation. No one realized what would grow up when, you know, DARPA first started connecting computers. So what's changed? Why are we incapable of summoning the will, the confidence, and the unity to produce similar achievements against a threat that is every bit as existential as World War II or the Cold War? The first and most obvious is the political system. I probably don't need to tell any of you how impossible it is to get the U.S. Congress to take action on any critical matter of long-term national security and prosperity. The other change, however, is the financial system. Current levels of government debt make a quote, new Manhattan Project for energy, unquote, impossible. At the same time, the evolution of the private sector financial system, particularly private equity in the stock market, favors quick returns over long-term investment, clear exit strategies over building new industries, and consumer-focused technologies, mobile phones and applications, social media, new forms of entertainment, over large and complex infrastructure projects. And again, we've seen a pretty clear example of that in what's happened with the Facebook IPO over the last several weeks. In other words, we can't do it because we've never done it before, and even if we could do it, the public will never support it. But again, there's a counterexample. The rebirth of the U.S. auto industry, based on $80 billion in federal loans and investments, allowed GM and Chrysler to exit bankruptcy and begin paying back the loans from the U.S. Treasury by the end of 2009. In the first quarter of last year, both GM and Chrysler, along with Ford, posted quarterly net profits and were achieving their first sustained net sales gains since the 1980s. The automakers' turnaround helped stabilize the overall U.S. economy and helped the manufacturing sector add almost 250,000 jobs between the end of 2009 and mid-2011. This was industrial policy. although nobody wants to call it that because that for years has been a term of contempt in Washington, and it worked. So what are the lessons for the energy industry from the auto bailout? First of all, there has to be a sense of crisis. Two major U.S. automakers failing in the midst of a global financial crisis constituted a crisis in most people's minds. But the majority of Americans, as I mentioned earlier, don't see the prospect of global warming as a crisis. Number two is that long-term social and national economic goals, not just narrow shareholder value, must guide the transformation. Having a strong and competitive auto industry is clearly seen as a key national interest. Having a strong, competitive, and innovative energy industry is also a key national interest. New technology must be the basis of the transformation. With a few notable exceptions, the nuclear power industry's plans for the next generation of reactors can be summarized as the same, only more so. Any nationwide energy strategy should promote and require the rapid development and deployment of new forms of nuclear power, especially liquid-fueled thorium reactors. Government support is necessary, but it must be limited and conditional. The big automakers wound up repaying the billions invested in them by the U.S. government, but that funding came with a price. They had to replace top executives and invest in new technology, come up with new labor relations and new production systems. Everyone had to give up something. And the transformation must draw on America's innate competitive advantages. The U.S. has the top engineering schools in the world, a vibrant alternative energy investment market, a pervasive, though aging power grid, and increasingly open and deregulated energy markets. Also, large numbers of investors, scientists, and entrepreneurs who view the energy crisis as the signal challenge of the 21st century. Plus, we invented thorium-fueled reactors. So how much would all this cost? These are a couple of graphs about trying to figure out what the real cost of energy is, and nuclear power is kind of in the middle of both these graphs. And there have been various attempts to calculate the overall cost of electricity from a thorium-fueled nuclear plant. That depends on many factors that are pretty hard to calculate right now, including the cost of capital, length of time to licensing, operating costs such as labor and overtime, operating efficiency, and so on. But various thorium supporters have calculated that the overnight costs for a lifter plant, the overnight costs are the cost to build and start up a plant, excluding interest and other collateral costs. And they came up with a range of around $2,200 per kilowatt of capacity, plus or minus 30% or so. So a 1 megawatt prototype plant would cost $2.2 million in overnight costs, and a commercial 1,000 megawatt plant would cost around $2.2 billion. Other estimators have come up with lower costs, around $1,400 per kilowatt. And I would argue that what we're going to see is once lifters, liquid fuel thorium reactors start to be built, the cost of the technology is going to come down fairly rapidly. But you have to factor in the social costs as well. Liquid fuel thorium reactors are carbon free. Their contribution to nuclear proliferation risks is essentially zero. They not only eliminate the cost of long-term storage of new radioactive waste, but also can process existing waste from conventional plants, making it very much easier to store. And they'll jumpstart a new era of energy technology innovation that will benefit companies and the nation in ways that are impossible to quantify right now. Considering those benefits, there's no question that thorium power offers the most economical avenue to bring online massive amounts of new generating capacity without adding to current levels of carbon emissions. So how much do we need? In 2010, the U.S. consumed about 3.8 million gigawatt hours of electricity. Coal accounted for 44% of that, nuclear, as I've said, for about 20%. Total U.S. electricity generating capacity is about 1,000 gigawatts. So under an optimistic scenario for renewable energy production from wind, solar, biomass, geothermal, and so on, let's say that to reduce carbon emissions enough to stave off catastrophic climate change, by 2050 we must increase the portion of our electricity generated by power to half. One half of 1,000 gigawatts is 500 gigawatts or 500,000 megawatts of capacity. That's a lot. So what are the goals? Electricity demand, of course, will grow in the next 4 decades. Some people think as much as 50 to 60%, but I'm being optimistic. So let's say that improved conservation technology and changing consumer habits will limit the increase in demand. And we must build enough new nuclear power plants to generate 500 gigawatts or 500,000 megawatts of clean, low-cost power by 2050. That's the equivalent of about 500 1,000 megawatt nuclear plants, or if we build smaller modular liquid fuel thorium reactors that can be mass produced in a factory, that would be about 2,250 megawatt reactors. That means between 2050 and 2050, over 30 years, we need to build about 17 new nuclear plants a year. Let's be ambitious and call it 20 new 1,000 megawatt thorium plants a year, or 80 250 megawatt lifters, for a total of 600 plants. That's a hugely ambitious goal. But again, how much will it really cost? One of the beauties of lifters is that they can be mass produced. Small modular reactors can be built in 250 megawatt sizes and assembled into larger plants. By comparison, Boeing builds about one $200 million jet a day. A modern airliner has many more moving parts and greater overall complexity than a liquid fuel thorium reactor. If we build, say, 4 plants for manufacturing lifters, with each plant producing 5 reactors a year, that would just about do the trick. Think about the jobs and the spillover economic benefits for the states in which those plants are located. Technology advances, again, will bring the cost down rapidly after commercialization, potentially to the cost of a new jet. Let's call it $1 billion per 1,000 megawatt plant. The cost of building 600,000 megawatt lifters, or 600,000 megawatt plants, or 2,400 250 megawatt machines, would come to $600 billion. Add 15% for startup costs and financing, round up, and you've got $700 billion. That's a lot of money. But let's put it in perspective. In 2010, the budget for the U.S. Department of Defense was about $685 billion, which, by the way, is almost as much as every other country in the world combined spends on their military. So, in other words, for about what we spend in 1 year on defense, we can build a thorium-based, carbon-free energy economy that could last a millennium. So, many people will, and frankly already have, scoffed at this program, calling it unrealistic, too expensive, too risky. Again, we can't do it because we've never done it before. But you have to consider the costs, direct and indirect, of building any other type of 1,000 megawatt power plant, whether it's coal, conventional nuclear, solar, natural gas, or of doing nothing and allowing climate change to run rampant by mid-century. Building a couple dozen lifters a year starts to sound like a bargain. It's important to remember the obstacles to creating a thorium power economy in the next 40 years are not technological or economic. They are political and commercial. Ultimately, the Thorium Revival is about the choices we make as a society. If we don't do it, it will be because we chose not to, not because it was impossible. Thanks very much. So we have some time for questions.
Yes, we have some time for questions. And if you have a question, please raise your hand. I'll give you the mic.
So Energy Secretary Chu was here, and I believe somebody asked him about thorium plants. And I think, if I recall correctly, his response was that the technology wasn't there. Like the liquid fluoride thorium salts are very caustic and would just eat through the piping or whatever. And what can you tell us about that?
What I can tell you about it is we've already done it. What this presentation doesn't cover, but is covered in 3 chapters in Superfuel, is that in the 1960s at Oak Ridge National Laboratory, we ran what was called the molten salt reactor experiment under Alvin Weinberg, who was the director of Oak Ridge at the time. And I've actually gone to Oak Ridge and I looked at Weinberg's papers, which and again, this will give you sort of an idea of how we've kind of neglected our history around nuclear power. His papers are stored at the Oak Ridge Children's Museum in a walk-in closet. And you walk in and there's literally filing cabinets stacked to the ceiling. And nobody has gone through them, cataloged them, indexed them. Anyway, the molten salt reactor experiment ran from about 59 to 73, and it was successful. They actually did not run it on thorium. They ran it first on conventional uranium U-235, and then they started introducing U-233. But they used molten salt, liquid fluoride, which is the substance that Secretary Chu was talking about. And there was a report at the end of that of the experiment, which basically said, and it had a cover letter in which the Atomic Energy Commission said, "Congratulations, your experiment was a tremendous success, and now we're shutting it down." And what happened was, instead of pursuing liquid fuel thorium reactors, we pursued fast metal breeder reactors. And that was the Clinch River project, which some of you may recall. I've actually been to the site that was where the Clinch River fast breeder was supposed to be built. I hopped the fence and trespassed on federal property and walked out to the river, and it's an empty field. We poured $8 billion down the rat hole of fast breeder reactors, and we didn't turn a spade. And so when people say it hasn't been proven, well, again, there's lots of things that haven't been proven that we go ahead and build and we figure it out on the way. Material science is an important component. The thing about lifters is they're going to run not for 20 or 30 or 40 years, they're going to run for 100 years. And we are, one of the remaining technological hurdles is to come up with the piping, essentially the plumbing, that will stand up for that long. But to say that we haven't developed this technology is just wrong. And just a side note on Secretary Chu, people in the thorium movement have combed his public utterances looking for the word thorium. And the fact is, he's in a constrained, politically appointed post. And so I'm not going to presume to know what's really on his mind. But I do know he's in favor of advanced nuclear. And I do know that thorium, everything else is an incremental step on what we've already done, and it uses uranium. Thorium power is the only truly innovative form of nuclear power technology that's available to us today. And, Secretary Chu is in a position where he's not about to outrage the entire existing nuclear power establishment by saying, we need to build thorium power reactors. So I find it hard to believe that he really believes a statement like that really ignores the history. Yes?
So you talked a little about, a fair amount about the U.S. sort of Congress and the inability to get stuff done. But what about like China and other countries that are maybe less constrained by history?
Thank you for asking. So in 2010, I was the first reporter in the West to break the story that China is pursuing a liquid fuel thorium reactor, and they have committed money to it, and it's a state-sponsored program, and so they're moving forward. India has a program that's actually been in place for a few decades, and they call it the three-stage program to build dozens of new reactors and convert them over time in three stages, as you might guess, to thorium reactors, but those are solid fuel reactors, and there's a lot of problems with that. The basic thing about putting solid thorium fuel into a more or less conventional reactor, I compare it to putting biofuel in a Hummer. It might be a little bit better, but you don't really capture the true advantages of thorium power. And so India and China are moving forward. And one other answer to that question, I did a story for Fortune last year on the rare earths market. And rare earths, as I'm sure everyone knows, are the lanthanide elements, which are used in a variety of high-tech applications, including smartphone displays, including missile guidance systems, including electric vehicles. And unsurprisingly, the U.S. used to be the world's leading source of rare earths. Today, China controls 98% of that market. When you find rare earths, you almost always find thorium. So there's these huge mines in Western China where they're producing rare earths for export mostly, and thorium is produced as a byproduct. And reports out of China are that they are stockpiling that thorium. Meanwhile, a company called Molycorp is restarting the Mountain Pass mine, which is on the border between California and Nevada. It's outside Las Vegas, which once was the biggest rare earths mine in the world. They're putting a few $1 billion into restarting production at Mountain Pass. And I was there last fall, and I said, what are you going to do with the thorium? And they are going to treat it as radioactive waste and bury it in concrete. And the executive said, if there were a market for this stuff, we'd love to sell it. But there isn't, and regulations require us to treat it as a radioactive waste. So China is stockpiling the stuff and planning on building lifters, and we are getting rid of it. So that's what's happening. And just one more word on that. A lot of people in the thorium movement present it as this, apocalypse for the U.S. If we don't build thorium reactors and we let China lead the way in this technology that we originally developed, we're never going to catch up, and it's going to be the Roman Empire all over again. I'm not quite that apocalyptic about it. There are many things that the U.S. still produces that other countries want to buy, but it is true that it would be crazy for us to give up the technology that we developed back in the 1960s to another country. And but the thing is, speaking as an internationalist, it would be a great thing if China built thorium-based reactors instead of, for instance, coal plants. Because if you want to do something about global warming, basically what the whole rest of the world doesn't matter unless we control it in China. And so, speaking as a citizen of the globe, it would be wonderful if China pursued this technology. Yes, sir.
So as you noted that basically the global warming and stuff like that is not going to convince the public, at least in near future. So why can't the alternative arguments like basically the limited resources of the fossil fuel or the rising cost of that can be used instead?
Well, here's one problem with the argument over limited resources of fossil fuels. Let's call it the peak oil argument for short. We keep finding more. Specifically, we keep finding more natural gas through hydraulic fracturing. And again, I'm not going to say that that's a terrible thing. That's a good thing for the U.S. And I'd rather build natural gas plants than coal plants. There's a really interesting talk by Nathan Myhrvold, former CTO of Microsoft, and it's on YouTube now, in which he talked about the natural gas boom. And he said, look, if you think that this is going to, A, provide, quote, energy independence, unquote, which is an illusion anyway, and B, solve global climate change, you're wrong. So natural gas, in combination with nuclear power, I call it NP plus NG. If we can build natural gas plants and bring thorium-based nuclear power online at the same time, that's a way out of the predicament. But to answer your question, the fact is I'm not sure what the argument is. Congress, there have been several bipartisan bills introduced in Congress to fund R&D for thorium, and they've never gotten out of committee. And there are friends of mine in the thorium movement who are lobbying hard to get something done. And, unfortunately, my view on that is that they're going to grow old waiting for Congress to do something. I do think that in combination with watching China forge ahead in this technology and the prospect of, losing another technology to the booming economies of East Asia, combining that with the prospect of global climate change does have a chance of convincing some of our political leaders and even convincing some of the public. Hopefully, the book and other efforts like it will gradually educate the public. And I think one of the things that we have to have happen is what I talked about in the presentation is overcoming this sort of knee-jerk response to nuclear power. And it's been interesting to watch the environmental movement sort of split as they realize, the real danger is climate change, and we need to sort of change our automatic response to any form of nuclear power, and you can just kind of watch that split happening. So what is going to convince people and politicians, I'm not sure, but I do think the sort of rising tide that I just described has a chance of doing it. Yes?
I was wondering what percent of the U.S.'s energy needs you envision thorium will satisfy? And there's a two-part question. Once that percent gets achieved, what do you think the price of energy would be compared to what it is right now?
Let's talk about price first. So the thing about nuclear power is all the costs are up front. It's all CapEx. Once you've got it, even uranium right now is cheap and plentiful, and there's plenty of people who, including me, who argue that's not going to last. But once you've got a nuclear power plant, it's very cheap to run. Somebody told me that the cost of fuel at a nuclear power plant is less than what they pay the security guards. So the challenge is the upfront financing. And this slide, I went back to this just to answer the first part of that question, which is the program that I've outlined is to supply half of our electricity capacity by 2050. In other words, about 500 gigawatts. And that's huge. I don't want to underestimate that at all. And building 600 nuclear plants between 2020 and 2050 seems impossible. But again, if we can shift our thinking and shift the process around building and deploying these plants, it's technologically achievable. So that's what I'm looking at, is basically half of our energy demand supplied by thorium-based nuclear power by 2050. And I just want to stress, I am all in favor of renewables, but they're just not going to do the trick in the next 30 to 50 years. The price of solar power is declining rapidly, and that's a great thing. But it's still, the percentage of sort of pure renewable power right now of our overall demand is in the low single digits, and it's not going to change significantly in my lifetime, frankly. So we do need nuclear power. I believe that we can get to 50% by 2050. And again, the cost is high, but in perspective, compared to what we spend on defense and what we would have to spend on other forms of power generation, it's a bargain.
Well, thank you.
Thanks very much. Thanks for having me.